Welcome back. On November 29, 1947, an obvious miracle occurred. The United Nations voted to create a Jewish state in part of the historic land of Israel. Those of you who watched our Israel Independence Day special will remember this story very well. If you haven't seen it yet, go to the Real America's Voice website and be sure to watch the Israel Independence Day special. But what makes the decision to create a Jewish state a miracle, you might ask? It's not like the splitting of the Red Sea or the 10 plagues in Egypt. When I say that the UN vote to create a Jewish state was a miracle, I'm not referring to the fact that at long last, after 2,000 years of exile, the Jewish people would now have an independent state in our ancient homeland. This is certainly a fulfillment of prophecy and a culmination of the unprecedented odyssey of centuries of survival and exile scattered throughout the world. The existence of the State of Israel is certainly a miracle, but that's not what I'm referring to when I use the term for the United Nations vote. The reason I refer to the United Nations vote of November 29, 1947, a miracle, is that the treatment of Israel by the UN ever since that day makes the decision to create a Jewish state appear impossible. When the impossible happens, for God's purposes, that's what we call a miracle. You see, ever since the State of Israel came into existence, it's been demonized by the UN, the same body that voted to create it. More than any other nation in the world, Israel comes under attack. For example, according to UN Watch, a Geneva-based NGO that monitors the UN Human Rights Council, from 2006 through 2022, the Council adopted 99 resolutions condemning Israel, 41 against Syria, 13 against Iran, 4 against Russia, and 3 against Venezuela. In 2022 alone, Israel was condemned 15 times in separate resolutions. The only other countries condemned at all were Russia 6 times, and North Korea, Afghanistan, Myanmar, Syria, Iran, and the United States with 1 each. That's a total of 12 condemnations for all other countries and 15 for Israel. And in 2023, the United Nations condemned Israel 14 times versus 7 condemnations for all other countries in the world combined. Just to further illustrate this absurd point, the member states on the UN Human Rights Council currently includes China and Cuba. So forgive us here in Israel when we don't take these UN resolutions too seriously. The truth is that it's difficult to find anything positive or productive that has ever come from the United Nations since the vote to create a Jewish state in 1947. And the crimes of the United Nations are not limited to its treatment of Israel. Joining me now is Ben Poser, executive editor of White Rose magazine, executive director of the American Anti-Slavery Group, and research director for the Jewish Leadership Project. Ben, welcome to Eyes on Israel.
It's very kind for you having me on. Thank you.
So Ben, I've been following your writing, and recently you wrote a piece on Tablet, published on Tablet magazine online, called The Genocide Enablers. And I don't think you were talking about the claims that Israel is committing genocide. Walk us through your piece and what you had to say about the United Nations.
Well, your perception that I wasn't talking about Israel's genocidal past is quite astonishing. So I guess the best way to start is at the beginning. Well, the UN has accused Israel of genocide. I actually had to look that up to make sure it was actually true, but that was true. But I remember, I'm a buff for history, and I'm a anniversary buff. So I knew that April 7th was not only the 6-month anniversary of October 7th of last year, but it was also the 30th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide beginning. And that brings us to something you were talking about, which is the early days of the UN. Now, the UN was formed for 2 purposes, really, pretty much, give or take. The first was to stop a hot third war, and the H-bomb pretty much made sure that wouldn't happen. But the other purpose, and this interestingly was encoded in 1948, was to stop any future genocide happening after the Holocaust. Well, unfortunately, Wikipedia is the only source which has the complete list, it appears, but I counted 18 genocides after 1945.
And these are real genocides, not like the accusation against Israel.
Yes, recognized genocides. I should have used that word. Now, if you have any eggs in your fridge, you'll find that they're the same shape as the number of genocides the UN has stopped in that time. And this is rather important because of this Rwanda thing. Now, I happen to know a little about Rwanda, and the UN pretty much did, let's put it this way, far worse than nothing in Rwanda. And what they did, as briefly as I can tell it in the time allotted, was that they had a peacekeeping effort on the ground in the beginning of 1994 to stop this Rwandan civil war. There was the Hutu-dominated government in Kigali, and then there was the Rwandan Patriotic Front, headed by the man who's now the president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, these are the Tutsi rebels up in the north. Hutsis would be nice because it would mean peace, but we'll talk about peace and ceasefire in a minute. But they were behind a ceasefire line, and there was a war going on, and it had stopped for a minute, and there was a peacekeeping negotiation. But General Romeo Dallaire, who was the Canadian general in charge of the peacekeeping effort, he'd found out that there was an informant who wanted to talk to the UN, and he said, this guy, that he was a trainer for the Interahamwe militia, these thugs who carried out the genocide when it happened. And this guy didn't want to work in that environment anymore, and he said, I'm training kids to kill Tutsis at the rate of 1,000 people every 20 minutes, so that's 3,000 people an hour. And we have weapons with which they're going to do this. And so on January 11th, 1994, Dallaire sent a cable to UN headquarters, the peacekeeping office, and said, hi, we have an informant who says there's going to be a genocide against all Tutsis and the Hutus who don't want to go along with us. Can I please go and get these weapons? And you know who his boss was? That was Kofi Annan, the same guy who said that Israel had committed a massacre when it was fighting terrorists in the Jenin refugee camp 22 years ago. And he said, not only you can't get those weapons, he said, share the intelligence which your poor informant has given you with the murderers planning the genocide, and also do not use force under any circumstances, and as it turned out, including self-defense. Because the Hutus murdered Belgian troops, and Dallaire was not only allowed, he wasn't allowed, but he wasn't able to save them. And so this was January 11th, and the genocide began on April 7th. And the UN also, I can't prove this was why, but Boutros Ghali, who used to be the Secretary General of the UN at the time, before he became Secretary General, it was 2 years before he became Secretary General, back when he was Foreign Minister of Egypt, he had sold Rwanda $26 million worth of weapons. And some of that was part of the cash, I'm pretty sure, which Dallaire was prevented from seizing. So I can't read motives there, but Dallaire's information was ignored, and then this would happen. But of course,
so Ben,
yeah, excuse me.
Ben, let me ask you a question. The picture you're painting, and of course we only have a few minutes. These are short segments on the show, and I want to encourage everyone to go read your piece so they get a fuller story. But you're giving one vignette of many, and
Just one.
encourage people, just one vignette of many, where you're saying that the UN not only does not prevent genocides from happening, but in many cases is complicit or even active in encouraging them?
Exactly. I mean, go to the Resolution 3379, the infamous resolution from 1975, which says that Zionism is a form of racism. There were two major genocides going on exactly when that was happening, the one in Cambodia and also in Uganda under Idi Amin, who helped...
And Cambodia under Pol Pot.
Yes. Idi Amin, who helped the Palestinian terrorists take the Israeli hostages in 1976. So the UN has a record we all know. And of course, there's Darfur. There's the issue of slavery in Sudan during the jihad there in the 1990s. They've never done anything to stop genocide. And yet, this is the best part. And there's so many similarities between what's going on now and Rwanda. I won't go into all of it. But there's a big difference. And the difference is that in Rwanda, the UN, even though they wouldn't use the word genocide, they did understand that the Hutus were the aggressors and the Tutsis were the victims. Today, they accuse Israel, the victims of an act of genocide, an obvious act of genocide, of being the ones who are perpetrating an imaginary genocide against the people who committed the real act of genocide, and saying that the people who were the perpetrators are the real victims. Now, if that sentence makes sense to you, what I just said, then you're the one who is nuts.
Ben, that says it all. We've only got about 40 seconds left. I want you to tell our viewers where they can follow your writing, where they can follow your work. And thank you so much for being on Eyes on Israel. I cannot stress enough, people need to read Ben's work on the UN to understand how bankrupt this body really is. So Ben, tell us where we can follow you.
Yes, it's mostly one place. It's White Rose Magazine. It's just whiterosemagazine.com. And I have 2 articles at Tablet Magazine. One, the one I just wrote, Genocide Enablers, and there's one I wrote with Dr. Charles Jacobs about slavery in Africa that came out, I believe, was December 11th of last year.
Ben, thank you so much for joining Eyes on Israel. We're going to have you back. And the issues that you cover, the slavery and the persecution of peoples, of Christians that goes on in the world right now, are critical issues that don't get enough play. Thank you for doing God's work.